Друзья, добрый день. Скажите, видно ли, слышно ли меня?
Да,
Добрый день, все хорошо.
Добрый день. Ну вот, я на прошлой неделе защитил свою диссертацию. Вот кто был и не был, можете меня еще раз поздравить.
Еще раз поздравляем.
Да.
Поздравляем!
Очень вовремя успели, Михаил Георгиевич, так сказать.
Да, это случилось как раз ровно накануне начала гражданской войны.
А то было бы совсем не до вашей диссертации, простите. Очень
Да.
удачно получилось.
Okay. Joel, we just discussed that it was very much in time that I defended my dissertation. Just on the eve of the beginning of the Civil War.
yes, congratulations that you got it. Yeah,
Thank you.
there's supposed to be a Chinese curse. May you live in interesting times.
Yes, exactly. One of my favorite pieces of Russian poetry of last century is a small poem by a not very well known poet about history. Joel, I'll recite it in Russian
Okay.
and make an examination for you, whether you can
Uh-oh.
translate it. Я на мир взираю из-под столика. Can you translate it?
I heard yeah. No, yeah.
I look at the world around me from under the table, from being under the table.
Uh-huh.
Век 20, век необычайный.
Okay, like the 20th century.
Yes, the 20th century.
Yeah.
Yes, is a very special century.
Uh-huh.
Чем столетие интересней для историка,
Yeah, something interesting and historical.
yes, to the degree a particular century is interesting for a historian, тем оно для современников печальней.
Okay.
To that degree, it's very sad and painful to those who live in it.
Yeah. Yeah, well, yeah, I've been thinking about, when, the attacks on our World Trade Centers happened. My daughter, I think she was about 10 at the time, but she said, well, at least this is history.
Yes, exactly.
So maybe Yihya Beseder will lie.
Yes. Okay. Let's return to our Gospel of Mark. Today is our last meeting in scholarly year. And we just dealing with the sandwiched story. We read about the healing of a woman who had, how do you call it in English? Hemorrhage?
Yeah, hemorrhage. Yeah.
Hemorrhage, yes. But this story is closely linked and with the story about the healing of the daughter of the elder of the synagogue. As far as I understand, this specific type of composition, when a story is put inside another story, is regarded as characteristic for Mark. Joel, can you tell us something, maybe just a couple of words, maybe more about this particular techniques of sandwiching that you encounter in Mark?
Yes, I think it's very characteristic of Mark. Though, he's not the only gospel writer who does it. John does it once. In the story of when Jesus is being examined by the authorities, and around that is the story of Peter denying Jesus. So that's also in John, and I don't think that means that John read Mark, but that maybe the story came down in that way. But we have a number of examples in Mark. One of the ones I think we've already seen is Jesus sends out his disciples in chapter 3, I think it is, or maybe maybe it was earlier in this chapter. He sends out his disciples, and then in between you have the story of John the Baptist having his head cut off, and then the disciples come back. And I think that, in a lot of these cases, the stories are meant to comment on each other and to illuminate each other, though sometimes it's difficult to see what the precise connection is. In this particular case, for example, Jairus's daughter, who Jesus raises from the dead, she's 12 years old. The woman with the hemorrhage has had the hemorrhage for 12 years. So what's the connection there? I think it's difficult to see exactly what it is, though some have suggested that, the woman's difficulty, has to do with menstrual bleeding, and the daughter of Jairus is 12 years old, so just on the verge of puberty. But it's not a very clear connection. Another interesting thing about these two stories is I don't always like feminist interpretations, but it is kind of interesting that both of these female characters are without a name. The only named people in these stories are males. Jesus and his 3 disciples, and Jairus, the father of the girl, is named, but not the girl herself. But in general, I think this is a form that Mark got from the tradition, but that he has expanded. He really likes this form, and I think in this particular case, maybe these are 2 female characters without much power, but the power to heal them comes from Jesus. So that's what I've got.
Yes, but what is the meaning? What is behind this particular strategy? Or in simple words, why did Mark like and use this particular way of putting stories together?
Well, I mean, maybe one thing is it's dramatic, right? Because like in this particular story, for example, the father comes to Jesus and he says, "My daughter is about to die." Right? So you think it's an emergency. But then, he's going to the synagogue ruler's house and he's stopped by this woman and he takes time to talk to her, so long that the girl does die. So, but then that allows him to do an even bigger miracle, which is healing somebody who's dead. So, maybe it's partly just for drama and for suspense. And maybe there's something similar in like when he sends out the disciples, and then you have the story of the beheading of John the Baptist. I don't know if this is right, but that also is a delay. So it's enough time for the disciples to go out and then come back. I mean, it doesn't make logical sense, but some people have suggested that there's a delay there also. But I think it's certainly true that in this particular case, in chapter 5, at the end of the chapter, I think there is a delay, and that delay creates suspense.
Okay, so this makes sense. This makes sense if a less important narrative is inserted inside a more important narrative. Can we put it this way?
So it's, I guess you could call this a chiasm, right? And actually, with chiasms, it's supposed to be the case that the central thing is more important. I'm not sure which is more important here. I mean, they're both, the story of the raising of Jairus's daughter is quite important because Jesus, brings life out of death.
Yes, this is the first history of resurrection in the Gospel of Mark.
Yeah, but I think the other one is also important because, especially because of the conversation that Jesus has with the woman, and he says, "Your faith has saved you." So she is some sort of model. She does more. She certainly does more than the girl who just is, all she does is die, and then is raised up by Jesus. But the woman with the hemorrhage is quite active. She steals healing from Jesus. She reaches out in faith. So I think she is a paradigm and an example of how we should all be. So I'm not sure one could say who is more important in these cases. And certainly in the case of, think of like Peter denying Jesus, and in between Jesus being examined by the Jewish authorities later on. I mean, what's more important there? They're both important, and they are opposite to each other because Peter, is confronted with a threat and he's afraid and he denies, whereas Jesus is confronted with a threat and he confesses. So they play off each other in that case, and they're both important, I think.
Okay. Because if we speak about a dramatic suspense, then it would have made more sense if the suspense is created before the bigger miracle or before the culmination of a more important story. But
Okay. Yeah. And in the story of Peter denying Jesus, I guess there also there's suspense there because there's a first denial. Peter denies him one time, and then there's the story of Jesus being examined. So you think that gives Peter time to relax a little bit, but then this other crisis breaks out. So I guess I'm just I don't want to say that the form itself means one story is more important than the other.
okay. In any case, we read the story that was inside the sandwich. This was our meeting during our meeting last Monday. We finished with the healing of the woman with the hemorrhage. You say yes?
Yeah, good.
The hemorrhage. So let's continue today with verse 35. I'll share my screen. Okay. Do you see it?
Yeah.
Yes. Wait. Stop.
Yes.
Мгм.
Кто хочет прочесть несколько первых стихов с 35 стиха, ну и дальше, скажем, вплоть до кульминационного момента, когда речь доходит до арамейского высказывания. Еще про арамейское высказывание с вами поговорим. С 35 стиха. Кира Сушкова, вы с нами?
Да, я могу, правда, я их уже читала в прошлый раз, но могу сейчас.
Ой, тогда, Ира, напомните, а где тогда мы кончили? Мне показалось, что как раз мы кончили перед 35 стихом. Может быть, я...
Ну вот арамейские слова мы прочли. Я как раз думала, куда там, где там ударение талита, кум.
Ага,
По-моему, и почему-то на этом не закончили. На 41-м, я думаю.
то есть мы кончили не на 35-м, а на 41-м.
Ну, мы прочли, но, наверное, не все обсудили просто.
Хорошо. George, sorry, I forgot that we read last time verses 35 through 48, the story about the healing and the resurrection of the daughter of the one who was at the head of the synagogue, the archi-synagogue. And once again, we come upon another thing that we encounter in Mark again and again. Namely, from time to time, we have Aramaic quotations.
Mhm. Yeah.
Can we say that this is a special stylistic device to mark more important things, or is it just an imitation of the strategy for the miracle workers to say something in a different language?
Well, it could be both. I think there is more Aramaic in Mark than in the other Gospels. So that, but usually, in these sort of stories, and also with Abba, in Gethsemane. I think it's possible that Mark was written in a bilingual environment, like in Syria, where, he's writing in Greek, but, probably Aramaic is also spoken. But certainly in a miracle story like this, it's significant that we have these words, Talitha Kumi, which, in the States, you see like Talitha Kumi Church, so these have become kind of sacred words. And, I think it's possible or probable that was already true when the stories were being told in the Gospels, that there's, special power in Jesus' original words. You also have it in Maranatha in the book of Revelation, right? That's also a powerful utterance, a magical utterance almost. Our Lord, come. And I think we already do see in some, miracle stories in, Greek literature with like Apollonius of Tyana, that specific mention, of miracle workers using barbaric words, right? Using non-Greek words, with special power.
Okay. А тогда на каком же стихе мы остановились, Ира? Простите, я вас тогда использовал как чтицу, но сам запамятовал, до какого места мы с вами вместе дошли. Как раз до 41 стиха.
Мне кажется, почему-то да.
Хорошо. Тогда давайте закончим эту историю с тем, чтобы потом перейти уже к 6 главе сегодня. Давайте начнем сегодня какую-то новую главу, потихонечку двигаясь. Тогда за вами, получается, стихи, настоящиеся от предшествующей нашей встречи, 42-43. Давайте, как обычно, вначале посмотрим на соотношение греческого и русского текстов, а потом попробуем прокомментировать. Угу.
Прочесть 42.
42-43.
Kai učius aneste to kurasion kai peripatai en gar eton dodeka. Kai existesan eutius extasei megale. Kai diesteva to autois pula ginabedeis gnoi. 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 Tuto, kai eipen дотенай ауте фагейн.
Да. Она тотчас встала и пошла, а было ей 12 лет. Вот это как раз одно из тех мест, на которое все время споткнулся, когда переводил Марка на русский язык, потому что, как знают всякий, кто изучал греческий хотя бы один семестр, греческая гара – это нормальный аналог русскому «ибо», вот, но нет никакого осмысленного объяснения, либо как маркер причинно-следственной связи. Она тотчас встала и пошла, потому что ей было 12 лет. Это абсурдно. Она тотчас встала и пошла, ибо ей было 12 лет. Не лучше. То есть здесь перед нами, как я уже говорил, это гар, который пытаюсь в Марке передавать просто-напросто простановкой соответствующего текста в скобочках. Это такой флешбэк который встречается в тех случаях, где Марку нужно дать какую-то информацию, которую он спохватывается, что хорошо было бы дать раньше. И это очень не греческое использование частички гар. Вот с нами есть отдельные филологи классики, которые могут это подтвердить. Маша, вы с нами?
Михаил Георгиевич, я не знаю, обсуждали или нет, но я и в прошлый раз хотел спросить, все-таки квадратные скобки воспринимаются как что-то текстологическое?
Как что-то что?
Что-то текстологическое,
Ну да.
не как обычные знаки препинания. Но вы настаиваете, что это лучше, чем круглые? Ну, конечно, такая совсем уже, может быть, пустая формальность, но вот говорю, я вот опять сейчас споткнулся. Хочется увидеть, что вот в поздних рукописях вот такое.
Хорошо. Это вы правы. Может, это просто для себя пытался отметить, что вот это те специфические круглые скобки, которые я вставлял для передачи греческого гар. Я не понимаю, как и откуда это употребление гар могло взяться.
Can I say something? So
Yeah.
you're talking about the gar clause in 42,
Exactly.
and aside from the question of how to translate it, I mean, I think it is, very likely that that's something that Mark has added. He always has these gar clauses to explain things. But so here, that's where you get the 12 years, right? And the 12 years is what connects this to the other story, one of the connections. So you can see him kind of working to make, probably to put this whole story in between the other, to put the other story in between, this story, and also to cement the connections with a detail like the 12 years.
Yes. So you think that it was Mark who added this background information specifically to link the two stories together?
That's what I would suspect, yeah.
Okay. It may be, but my question was a bit more linguistical.
Yeah, philological.
Yes, definitely gar here is not a marker that marks cause and effect, which was the normal meaning of this particle in Greek.
Yeah, Mark's gar clause.
Yes, okay.
His gar clauses often, you wonder why is the gar there? Why? Yeah, we have a saying in English. What is the therefore there for? It's a pun in English. Why is it there? Because it does seem, as you've in your translation, you put it in brackets. It's parenthetical information. So I think that's a good way to do it.
As far as I understand, in the Greek language itself, there is nothing to explain this meaning of gar, just like a marker of an important information that the author should have inserted earlier, but forgot to do it, so that now the author inserts it. On the one hand, sometimes such an additional information is really, or at least can be connected with the narrative, with the semantics of cause and effect. Can it be that it was from such places where Mark used this gar to give a background in the sense of cause and effect? He developed the more generalized use of gar to mark a sort of flashback, giving additional background information. Or was it some kind of Arameism behind this?
Yeah, I haven't ever seen anybody suggesting that it's an Aramaism, but that would be interesting to examine. I mean, it is awkward, and you can see that it's awkward because when Matthew and Luke retell these stories, you know, these awkward gars often drop out, or you know, they have a smoother way of sometimes they'll drop out the gar clause, or sometimes they'll change the syntax so that it's easier in Greek. But yeah, the idea of an Aramaic particle in the background is interesting. But I don't think that it's possible that somebody explored that, but I can't remember.
I just consulted Adela's commentary. She tries to make a sense out of what I would rather regard as nonsense. I quote, the age of the girl is given as 12 years, and since the clause given information is connected with the preceding by the conjunction gar, for it is evident that the datum is given in order to explain that she was old enough to walk.
Yeah, that seems kind of ridiculous to me. Yeah, because I think you would have assumed from the rest of the. I mean, he's called her a Korasion at the beginning of the story, you know, which is not a term for an infant. So I think you already know that from the beginning of the story. I'm going to look at the Syriac and see. I think sometimes the Syriac will retain the gar, you know, gar.
Yes, but this cannot give us any clue to Mark, because Syriac gar developed from the Greek gar during the centuries, when Greek had an influence on the Syriac, such an influence that even some particles were borrowed from Greek into Syriac. I'm pretty sure that Syriac retains Mark and gar here. You may look whether or not, but this doesn't give us a clue to what might have been there in the Aramaic tradition before Mark, because definitely Aramaic tradition before Mark was not as heavily influenced by the Greek language as is the case with the Syriac.
Yeah, I mean, but Greek influence like Mishnaic Hebrew, so I mean, I think there was some influence there from like the Roman occupation. I'm just looking at the. Oh yeah, ger, yeah, both the Peshitta and the Harkleons, they have the ger there.
Yes. Okay. Joel, if you have somewhere in your bibliography some references to works dealing with that gar and Mark, I would be very grateful to you for
Well, yeah, I was thinking of,
Just the references.
I'll look after the session at, I mean, there is a book on Semitic syntax in Mark's, influence of Semitic syntax on Mark's gospel, and I'll see if he says anything about the gar or what. I'll send you some bibliography on the gar.
Okay, thank you.
But
It
you
will
must,
be
if I send it to you, you must guard it. Guard it with your life. Guard the gar article.
okay. I like things where we can check, support, approve, or disprove any hypothesis about the history of the text or its exegesis with the palpable linguistic criteria, like in this case. I agree with you that, to my mind, Adela's suggestion here is just an attempt to read the Greek text as though it was a normal Greek text with a normal Greek meaning of gar. I
Yes,
do not.
Adela is more logical than Mark was.
Okay, as concerns the very end of the story, there are two topics that we have already met. One is the topic of изумление. I'm not sure it was the right way of rendering this into Russian, because of course in Greek we have a much stronger word, экзестасен, it is экстасы мегale. Все пришли в экстаз великим экстазом. Не знаю. Я подумал, может быть, какое-то более сильное слово здесь имеет смысл сказать. Это далеко не единственный раз, где мы встречаемся у Марка вот с этим выражением экзистами или экстасис для выражения реакции народа по отношению к чудесам, которые творит Иисус. Ну и, конечно же, уже в который раз мы встречаемся с темой мессианского секрета. Иисус велит никому не рассказывать о происшедшем, но мы уже знаем, что все эти случаи, где Иисус велит, они регулярно нарушаются. Как минимум нарушаются рассказчиком, да? Вот это нарушение служит как раз к вящей славе Иисуса. Joel, do you have anything to add to these two standard stories?
Yes. Well, yeah, I wanted to say one thing about the end of the story. I mean, it illustrates how illogical the messianic secret idea can be sometimes, because, so you have this situation where, the synagogue ruler has come to Jesus asking him to heal the daughter. There's this big crowd around, and, then Jesus stops and heals this other woman. And then people come and they say, your daughter is dead. And Jesus says to the guy, only believe. And he takes him and his 3 disciples, and they go in. They're the only ones who go in. Jesus heals the daughter. And then he says, give her something to eat and don't tell anybody, what's happened. I mean, how is that going to work? Because everybody has, heard that she was dead. They've seen Jesus go in with a small group. They are going to see her then walking around and alive again. So what sense does the command to secrecy make here? in larger context of the story, it doesn't make any narrative sense at all, really. You see what I'm saying?
Yes, that's exactly what you can see, for example, in verses 36, 37 of chapter 7, Mark. Jesus tells people not to tell any stories about his miracles, but then the more he forbids people to speak about it, the more they retell these stories. This is, I think, that's the essence of Messianic secret. It's a secret not to be kept, but a secret to be violated.
Well, yeah, and it's a secret.
Secretly.
It's a secret that's violated in, just in telling the story, because for the reader, the reader sees all this going on. But I mean, I think it's partly that, these sort of miracles are often done in secrecy, right? Not only in the Gospels, but in other related literature, that it's it's, part of the whole magical atmosphere. You go into a secret place and that's where it takes place. But, here, this is, I think, the most illogical one from the point of view of narrative, because of the impossibility of keeping the secret in the circumstances. The other thing I wanted to mention was there is a really interesting parallel in Apollonius of Tyana, his Philostratus's Life of Apollonius of Tyana. Maybe if I can find it. Healing. So I'll try to find it and read it to you later on.
Okay. Should we move on to the next pericope, the next chapter? Joel, we'll move to chapter 6, okay?
Yeah.
Сейчас виделось на доске 6 глава?
Да.
На виртуальной доске. Хорошо. Ира, ничего, если мы тогда продолжим вашу функцию частицы?
Да.
Давайте 6 глава, первые 3 стиха.
Kai excelten eketen, kai ergetai eisten patrida autu, kai akolutusin auto hoi matetai autu. Kai logomeno sabatu erxato didasken en te synagoge, kai polloi apuntes exeplesonto legontes, poten tuto tauta, kai tis he Sophia he doteisa tuto, kai hai dynamis toiautai diaton heiron autu dinomenai. Hutosestin hotekton, hyos tes Marias, kai Adelphos Iacobu, kai Iosetos, kai Iuda, kai Simonos, kai eisin hai Adelphai autu hode pros hemas, Kai scandalizonto en auto.
Спасибо. Евхаристо.
If I found my passage, can we go back and can I read you this passage from Apollonius?
Окей.
Okay, so this is from Philostratus, Life of Apollonius of Tyana, chapter 45. Okay. It's not exactly alike, but I think you'll see it's enough alike. This is a miracle which Apollonius worked. A girl had died just in the hour of her marriage, and the bridegroom was following her bier, her the place where they put the body. He was lamenting, he was crying, the bridegroom was crying, as was natural because his marriage was unfulfilled. And the whole of Rome was mourning with him, for the maiden belonged to a consular family, an important family. Apollonius then, witnessing their grief, said, "Put down the bier, for I will stop the tears that you are shedding for this maiden." So he tells them to stop crying, which is, in our story, Jesus, there's these people crying when Jesus goes in to heal her, and he tells them that she's not really dead. And he asked what was her name. So, there you see the name is important to the healing. Not in our story, but in other miracle stories, you get the name. The crowd thought that he was about to deliver a speech, as is commonly done at the grave, but he did nothing of the kind. He didn't deliver a speech. He merely touched her, and he whispered in secret some spell over her. He at once woke up the maiden. He woke her up from her seeming death. So here it's interesting. It's a more rationalistic miracle. It only seems like she's dead. And the girl spoke out loud and returned to her father's house. And at the end of the passage, the author Philostratus says, "Now whether he detected some spark of life in her, which those who were nursing her had not noticed, or whether her life was really extinct, I can't tell you." So he's more rationalistic, right, than Mark. He says, I don't know, maybe, she just seemed to be dead. She wasn't really dead. I don't, maybe she was dead, maybe she wasn't. But the technique is kind of similar. And it's a young girl, and he heals her with a word. And she speaks, showing that she's not dead anymore. Just as in our story, the girl walks around to demonstrate the. So anyway, it's an interesting passage for comparison and contrast, I think, because it is more rationalistic in its treatment of this apparent miracle than Mark is.
Can we suggest and suppose that there was a kind of purpose that was characteristic for both Hellenistic milieu and Jewish milieu, just widespread around different cultures, diffused around among different cultures of the Eastern Mediterranean?
Yeah,
Because, of course, there are too many correspondences to be just a coincidence, pure coincidence.
Yeah, and and also, you have miracle workers in the Talmud too, like Honi the circle drawer, is often compared to Jesus. And so I think in all of these cases, the miracles show the power and authority of the individual. you know, that he is, you know, sent by God. And I mean, when I was doing my PhD, and as a matter of fact, Carl Holliday's PhD was about the whole idea of a divine man, and you know, in Hellenism, that was then taken up in Jewish and early Christian circles. I think that Carl's dissertation was trying to play down some of these, you know, to point up the differences. But I think there's some strong similarities, and it authorizes the teacher, as it shows that he is from God.
Okay,
But
but
you
still,
also had people who were skeptical about it, though, you know. And I mean, Apollonius or Philostratus is somewhat skeptical, or he doesn't want to jump in all the way. And then Lucan, you know, writes a whole treatise about somebody, a pseudo prophet, who claims to be performing all these sorts of miracles, but is really just a fraud. So, you know, that it was a known type. There was a known type of a healer, which I think on the popular level, you know, lots of people accepted. In the more intellectual circles, sometimes people were more skeptical about. Sorry, I go on too long.
no, that's okay. And I think that this comparison with the life of Apollonius was really important. Should we return to chapter 6? Okay. Ну вот Ира нам прочла начальные стихи. Надо сказать, что я когда-то довольно много вот с Евангелием от Марка как-то работал, пытаясь ее перевести на русский язык. Но вот сейчас, когда мы так вот двигаемся, останавливаясь на каждом слове, слово за слово, я понимаю, насколько, вот, может быть, какие-то здесь места требуют более тщательного и пристального внимания и какой-то правки. Вот сейчас, например, посмотрел на первый стих 6 главы. Конечно же, здесь слово «excelten», он вышел. Да, это здесь такая как бы просто связка, которая должна обеспечивать переход от одной истории к другой истории. Но в то же самое время это у нас же здесь, мы много раз видели, это «excelten». Это такое ключевое слово, когда Иисус говорит о том, что я вышел, да, «excelten» для того, чтобы проповедовать, да, то есть у нас это не просто какая-то такая мелкая деталь, а получается ключевой момент именно вот даже в переходных каких-то пассажах. Поэтому, не знаю, заметили вы, нет, пока Ира читала, я посмотрел и поправил немножко первую главу. Иисус вышел оттуда, чтобы сохранить вот это постоянное перевод, единообразный перевод «excelten» ключевых слов, и направился в свой родной город. Вот сейчас я задумался, может быть, вот этот свой родной город тоже как-то нужно было поменять, вышел оттуда и направился к себе на родину. И сейчас, может быть, для того, чтобы мотивировать, почему я вот сейчас решил изменить этот текст. Ира, давайте попросим вас еще прочесть в завершении к вашим 3 стихам еще и 4 стих сегодня, да?
Kai elegen autois ho Iisus, hoti ukastin profetes atimos eime en te patridi autu, kai entois sun geneusin autu, kai en te oikia autu.
Да, вот этот текст, 4 стих, который сейчас Ира прочла, он выглядит как некоторая такая пословица, да? И, возможно, что эта пословица, она предшествовала тому нарративу, с которым мы здесь встречаемся у Марка, и, наоборот, некоторым образом послужила толчком к тому, чтобы из этой пословицы развернулся весь тот нарратив, с которым мы здесь встречаемся. То есть, с одной стороны, да, вот у нас здесь есть мотив, который постоянно пронизывает, естественно, Евангелие от Марка, мотив неверия. Слушатели не верят Марку. То есть, с одной стороны, они приходят в изумление, с другой стороны, они не верят и сомневаются. Вот, может быть, я посмотрел просто, где у нас встречается замыслово патрис, отчизна. Это достаточно редкое слово. У нас в Евангелии от Марка встречается только здесь вот, в этой 6 главе, в 1 стихе и в 4 стихе. В 1 стихе, где говорится о том, что Иисус вышел и направился к себе на родину, Эйстен Патрида Ауту. И далее в 4 стихе в контексте пословицы. Она встречается у нас, опять же, дважды в 13 главе Евангелия от Марка, Евангелия от Матфея, там, где Матфей пересказывает эту историю. Она у нас встречается, опять же, в Евангелии от Луки, в 4 главе, где опять мы встречаемся с той же самой, с вариантом той же самой пословицы. Иисус говорит: «Амен лагу химин, протиудейс профетас дектос истин энте патриди ауту». Истинно говорю вам, что никакой пророк не принимается у себя на родине. Да? И такой достаточно редкий случай, когда у нас та же самая тематика отражена не только у синоптиков, но и в Евангелии от Иоанна. Да, это 4 глава Евангелия от Иоанна, 44 стих, John 4:44. Давайте я сейчас выведу вот эти места на доску. То есть сейчас видно то, что я... Извините. Что у нас случилось с компьютером? Сейчас видно на экране BibleWorks?
Видно.
Да. Посмотрите, такое слово, которое у нас встречается вот у Марка, да, вот те стихи, которые мы сейчас с вами читали. Точно его, не точно, но его приложение Евангелие от Матфея, да, говорится, кай аутол эстен патрида ауту эдидаскен аутус энте синагоге. И дальше следует та же самая история, которую мы только что сами читали у Марка. И он завершает теми же самыми словами «Укастин профетес атимус эме энте патриди кенте уикия ауту». Чуть-чуть у нас текст Марка подправлен. Думаю, что подправлен сознательно, потому что мы неоднократно сталкивались в Евангелии от Марка с мотивом того, что родственники Иисуса, родные его, мать и братья, его не принимают. И мы видим, что в более поздней традиции этот мотив того, что родные не принимают Иисуса, который так вот очень бросается в глаза у Марка, в более поздней традиции, вот уже даже у Матфея и Луки, он как-то is downplayed, да? То есть то, что мы читаем у Марка, у Кастин профетес атимус эме энте патриди ауту, кай энтой сингеневсин ауту, кай энте уикия ауту. У Матфея у нас все почти сохраняется. У Кастин профетес атимус эме энте патриди ауту, кай энте уикия ауту. Убираются родственники. Вот, мы встречаем немножко другой вариант, скорее всего, не заимствованный от Марка, но схожий совершенно. У Луки, да, «Амен легу гмин готи удейс пропетес дектос эстин энте патриди ауту». Как с точки зрения выбранных слов, так и с точки зрения общей композиции, все-таки немножко не совсем то же самое. В Евангелии от Иоанна. Autός Iisus mărturisen vote profetas ente idea patrici timen uc echei. This parallelism that is witnessed not only by the synoptic gospels, but also by John's gospel.
Yeah, it's interesting. And which do you think is earlier? I mean, I'm trying to, is Mark's version an expansion of something like John's version, or does John's version, cut out the reference to his family? Because, I mean, it's certainly true that Jesus's family doesn't come off very well in Mark's gospel.
Oh, definitely. And it was a problem for later exegetes, especially for Orthodox exegetes with good faith.
And that reminds me of our earlier discussion of the sandwich technique, because another example is in chapter 3 in the Beelzebul controversy. It starts with the family looking for Jesus, and then you have his controversy with the scribes about Beelzebul, and then you come back to the family. So there's a parallelism between the scribes, and who are Jesus' opponents, and the family, and they both kind of say that he's crazy. So that's another that illustrates, how dark the picture is of the family in Mark. So yeah, I mean, maybe, but I think you could argue it either way when you're comparing John and Mark. Either John doesn't like that, and Matthew and Luke don't like, the emphasis on the negative quality of Jesus' family, so they've gotten rid of it. Or you can argue that this, the original form of the saying is just a reference to the homeland, the fatherland, and that Mark has expanded it. So.
Yes, but I think the only thing that we can say for sure is that the Gospel of Matthew, the text of Matthew, seems to be secondary with regard to what we see in the Gospel of Mark, as concerns parallels in Luke and John.
Mm-hmm.
I think that even Luke here should be regarded as independent from Mark and probably closer to the tradition we have in John.
Yeah, it could be. Sometimes there's parallels between Luke and John that are difficult to explain.
Yes.
Another interesting thing I wanted to mention is another parallel is the parallel with the language of the first miracle in chapter 1, the healing of the possessed man in chapter 1, 21 to 28. So verse 121, and on the Sabbath he went into the synagogue and immediately began to teach. In Mark 6:2, and when the Sabbath had come, he began to teach in the synagogue. So that's very similar. 122, back to chapter 1, and the people were amazed at his teaching. Chapter 6, verse 2, and many people, when they had heard him, were amazed. Back to 127, they said, "What is this? A new teaching with authority." In chapter 6, where does this man get these things? What wisdom has been given to him? Chapter 1, he gives orders to the unclean spirits and they obey him. Chapter 6, and such works of power are performed by his hands. The terminology is quite similar. But in this story, in chapter 6, it takes this turn into, you think that the story from verses 1 and 2, you think it's just going to be, a story about how great Jesus is, because they're saying all the wonderful things that he does and what wisdom he has. But then all of a sudden in, I guess it's, and then in verse 3, they start talking about, well, he's just the carpenter, he's the son of Mary, and his family is all with us, and they are scandalized. I mean, that's not what you expect from the beginning of the story. And it's not what you expect on the basis of this earlier story in chapter 1, which is so similar. But now the whole thing takes a swerve. And we're in a different section of Jesus' ministry where he's encountering opposition, not just from demons, but from human beings. So I think, chapter 1 was a honeymoon period, but now the honeymoon is over. And the same powers which were opposing him from the beginning directly through the demons are now opposing him through the authorities. But it's I have a chart in my commentary on the parallels between 1:21 to 28 and 6:1 to 6, and they're really, I think the parallels are strong enough that he must have intended you to think of that earlier story, but also to see how different this story ends up.
Yes, so we think that it's a kind of a new beginning.
Well, I think it's a time of, yeah, it's recalling the beginning, but it's a time of increasing conflict, right? I mean, the gospel has had conflict from the very beginning. There's always been conflict with the demons. And from chapter 2 on, there's conflict with the authorities. And they already decided to get rid of Jesus in chapter 3. But, you know, I think you do have a sense of increasing opposition in this section of the gospel.
I mean, the circle is becoming narrower and narrower. So from chapter 2 on, we have opposition from the authorities. Here, he's rejected in his own homeland, so that finally in the last chapters of the Gospels, he will be betrayed and abandoned even by the disciples.
Yeah, and you know, and it's interesting, you know, they don't, in this chapter, people don't deny, you know, that he's performing miracles, but you know, they're upset by that. And so it does recall the again, the Beelzebul controversy. You know, there also the authorities didn't deny that he was performing miracles, but they said that, you know, where do these miracles come from? So, but you know, but I think anybody reading verses 1 to 2 would not expect the continuation of the story here. It's really surprising, and it's kind of weird. It's uncanny. You know, there's this sense of the uncanny and the weird and the strange, and the, you know, not just human forces are at work.
Okay, but if the occurrence of this part of this topic in Mark, in Luke, and in John testifies to the existence of this topic, this motive, this proverb within the word and tradition of the early Christianity, then let's go back to our text. Wait a second.
Good idea.
Wait a second. Yes. Can we say that the narrative in Mark verses 1 to 3 may be seen as a narrative generated by this particular proverb, because the proverb itself, we meet it in Mark, in Luke, probably independently from Mark, in John, most probably independently from Mark. But the narratives are different.
Mm. Yeah. But I mean, certainly, yeah, the saying is central to the story. That's what it's all leading up to. But I think it's also generated by a historical memory of, Jesus was not accepted by the people from his area and by his family. I mean, I don't think that's the sort of thing that Mark would just make up if it wasn't true, because, like, as you said before, it caused problems for later Christians. So there must be some historical memory there.
But I also paid attention to this. There is a very rare word, patrice,
Uh-huh.
which outside of this story occurs only in this proverb or in this topic, which is common to all the Gospels.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting.
It may be regarded the repetition of patrice here in the narrative and patrice in the proverb, which is a summary of the narrative.
Well, and that's interesting because, like, in verse 3, Jesus is referred to as the son of Mary, and the brother of Jacob. No mention at all of his father, right? Of his earthly father. And which, I mean, I don't think it's a very common, to refer to a male without mentioning the father. So, the absence of the father from verse 3 is striking, and maybe that goes together with the presence of the term patrice somehow. Is it really his fatherland?
Up till now, I had an idea about this patrice, namely that the proverb that a prophet is not accepted in his patrice might have been common knowledge widespread in the early Christian community, and that the repetition of this patrice in the narrative, in the particular narrative in Mark 6:1, may be regarded as a sign that this narrative, at least in the form that we have it now, developed from the proverb that is now written here as a summary of this narrative.
I mean, this is one of the things that Debelius says about these pronouncement stories, right? In his book on form criticism, that, sometimes the origin is just the saying, and then the story forms around the saying. So I think you could speculate that may have been what happened.
Okay, but of course, the point that you made, that differently from what one might have expected and should have expected from the story originated in the Semitic milieu, to speak about someone without mentioning his father, without mentioning his patronymics, while mentioning his mother and brothers and sisters, it's very extraordinary. And this may well be an indication. This goes back to the very, very early stratum of the tradition.
Yeah, and we know, that there's later Jewish polemic against Jesus as a bastard, right? And as the son of a Jewish mother and a Roman soldier, even. So, people have wanted to link the terminology in verse 3 with, some sort of memory like that about, his possible illegitimacy. I mean, but it is strange not to mention the father, even if he's dead, right?
Yes. And of course, the story is, in some sense, it counterbalances the stories that we just had read, because those stories, they were about faith. It was, as we have seen, it was a central concept here.
Yeah.
Yes, твоя вера спасла тебя. Yes,
Epistis su sesakense, yeah.
yes, epistis su sesakense.
Yeah, whereas this story is about apistia. It's about lack of
This is
faith.
about epistia, yes.
And it's really strange. At the end of this story, Jesus, he's performed all these miracles before, but look at verses 5 and 6. Uk edunato, he could not perform even a single miracle, except, then there's he did perform a few miracles, but basically, and he was amazed, verse 6, he was amazed at their apistia. So, I mean, and that is, it's remarkable, Jesus is apparently not expecting this reaction. It takes him by surprise. And he is not able to perform miracles. That's an extraordinary statement, I think.
And as far as I remember, Matthew corrected it.
I don't think Matthew left verse 5 in, though, the first part of verse 5. I'm sure he left it out, yeah.
I think Matthew changed it that he did some miracles, but not as much as one should have expected. Let's look at.
Yeah, Matthew 13:53.
Yes, can you read it?
Yeah, kai uk epoiesin eke dunamis palas, diatein apistian auton. So he didn't perform many miracles there. But it doesn't say anything about Jesus not being able to perform miracles. So that's really an extraordinary statement which Matthew leaves out.
Yeah, so that one change is that there is no mention about Jesus unable to perform miracles, and then the change from udemian, to not many miracles is also quite an important change.
Yeah.
It seems that if we compare this story with what we read earlier, that your faith saved you. Faith is perceived here as a kind of entity, a kind of substance that can save, or if it is not here, it doesn't save, kind of a substance somehow even independent of Jesus.
Yeah, well, certainly you get that from the story of, the woman in chapter 5 who steals, his substance, his faith healing substance. But,
Yes,
but in spite of all this, you know, at the very end, verse 6b, kai periegen tas komas huklo didaskon, he still goes around teaching. Even though he's encountered all this negativity, he doesn't give up on the whole area, right?
yes, but I think here we also have a very important thing that he goes around these villages teaching.
Yeah,
Normally in Mark we have when we speak about Jesus going around
mhm,
some area, he
Yeah.
teaches, he both teaches and performs miracles.
yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, here he does perform a few miracles and he teaches, and you're not told, you know, how successful the teaching is either, but then he does send the disciples out. And what, we don't have time to go into this, but what's really strange is Jesus is unsuccessful in his teaching and or in his performing miracles, but the disciples are able to perform a lot of miracles. So Jesus has relative lack of success and in comparison with the disciples. You have to go down, let's see, to verse, wherever that is, closer to the end of when they come back in in verses 12 and 13. The daimonia pala ex ebolon kai elephon eliu palus arustus. So he can only heal a few, they heal many.
Yes, it's an interesting position. I haven't paid attention to this before you draw attention to this.
Well, this is what comes out of having to translate and think about every single word in this gospel.
Okay.
It's an extraordinary juxtaposition.
Да. Мы немножко уже забежали в текст, который наша чтица Ира еще нам не читала. Ира, прочтите нам стихи 5 и 6.
Kai uke diunato ekei poiesai udemian diunamen. Ei me oligois arrostois epiteistais heiras eterapeusen. Kai etaumadzen liaten apistion auton. Kai periegen tas komas tuklo didaskon.
Да. Вот здесь, конечно же, еще момент, который тоже поражает нас, это то, что обычно в предшествующих текстах мы читаем, что народ поражается или приходит в экстаз, созерцая чудеса Иисуса. Здесь происходит нечто обратное. Он поражается и поражается их неверием, их апистия. Ну что же, мы подошли к концу этой перекопы, может быть, одной из самых, хочется сказать, архаических перекоп внутри Евангелия от Марка. Если мерить степень архаичности текста, тем насколько он вызывает ощущение описанное глаголом таумадзу, да, у последующих благочестивых читателей. Вот. Благочестивый читатель, читающий это перекопу, несомненно, не может не быть ею поражен. Ну, вот наше пристальное чтение Евангелия от Марка, наше close reading, мне кажется, дает нам что-то очень многое, даже хотя я вроде бы переводил текст и, переводя, часто над ним задумывался, но вот сейчас, разбирая его с такой степенью подробности, с какой мы с Джоэлем последние месяцы его разбирали, все больше и больше понимаю, насколько вот перевод мне казался более-менее как-то отражающим какие-то вещи, насколько его нужно переделать и переписать. Думаю, что, может быть, и многие из нас, которым тоже, естественно, Евангелие от Марка так иначе хорошо знакомо, вот от нашего close reading, видеть в нем какие-то вещи, которые так с первого взгляда нас с первого взгляда не бросаются в глаза. Вот. Спасибо, Джоэль, за то, что вы были с нами.
Congratulations to you, and I hope everybody stays safe.
Okay. We also hope that now we have a 2 months break. We'll continue our slow reading of the Gospel of Mark. Or better to say, yes, so under condition of the letter of Jacob. We hope that we meet in September and continue our slow reading of the Gospel of Mark.
Be'ezrat Hashem, we say.
Ezrat Hashem. Exactly. And once again, Joel, thank you for that wonderful job you did guiding us through the Gospel of Mark.
Well,
I would suggest that you just thank you in this way.
well, thank you. It's been a great experience for me, and I trust we will continue in a few months. So go with God.
Thank you. Let God be with us in all the difficulties that are before us.
And if you could send me the poem about the Viek. I'd like to see that.
What?
About the 20th century.
Okay.
Спасибо. Bye.
Спасибо. Bye.
Спасибо.
Спасибо, всего доброго.
До свидания.
Спасибо.
До встречи.
Спасибо. До свидания.
Да, нет.